A Gentle Introduction to Unqualified Reservations. Chapter 1, The Red Pill. Mencious Moldbug, January 8th, 2009. I thought it would be fun to kick this year off by retro-introducing Unqualified Reservations, for the purpose of innocent new readers and the crazy old ones as well. Continuing UR readers, obviously you are not crazy. It's everyone else who's crazy. Thanks for coming back in 2009. If you need a link to introduce your other friends, your other crazy friends, to UR, this might be a good one. New UR readers. Unfortunately, I'm lying. There is no such thing as a gentle introduction to UR. It's like talking about a mild DMT trip. If it was mild, then it wasn't DMT. UR is a strange blog. Its goal is to cure your brain. We've all seen The Matrix. We know about red pills. Many claim to sell them. You can go, for example, to any bookstore and ask the guy behind the counter for some Noam Chomsky, and what you'll get is blue pills soaked in red number 3. Since we provide the genuine article, UR is pretty much the anti-Chomsky. As a broad generalization, UR's stance in any controversy will probably be the opposite of Chomsky's. Take one of our red pills, or heck, split one in half, and you'll be in a completely different world. Like DMT, except that the DMT really, and DMT's reality, is much prettier than your old reality. UR's is uglier. Also, DMT wears off. Alas, our genuine red pill is not ready for the mass market. It is the size of a golf ball, though nowhere near as smooth, and halfway down it splits in half and exposes a sodium metal core, which is pretty searing. And it'll sear your throat like a live coal. There will be scarring. What can we say? That's what you get for being an early adopter. But at least you didn't buy a Newton. Linked here is the Wikipedia reference to the Apple Newton. The Newton is a series of personal data assistance PDAs developed and marketed by Apple Computer Inc., an early device in the PDA category. This was put out on February 27th in 1998. It's been a long time. Anyway, as we were. When we think about red pills and blue pills in the real world, obviously we are thinking about the Orwellian mind control state. We are not going to cure your whole brain. After the treatment, for instance, you may still be a Celtics fan. Our chemical interest is solely on the political lobe. Unfortunately, this organ is unusually large and proliferating fast. After the treatment, it will return to its normal marble-like size, and you may hear a hollow sound if you knock at the back of your head. That's because now you know the truth, and you'll never need to think about any of that crap ever again. Since the shape of your skull is unchanged, the resulting void is percussive. When we think about the Orwellian mind control state, we generally think about a few big obvious examples. The Nazis, the Soviets, so on. These regimes, of course, specialize in implanting bizarre, murderous notions, instructions in their subjects' brains. If you must visualize these implanted Orwellian modules, you can think of them as little worms, like in Wrath of Khan, that crawl into your ear and stay there. One imagines writing a letter to a dedicated National Socialist, explaining why he should expel his evil neural parasite, and instead become a good liberal, and signing it, quote, Das Future, unquote, and emailing it, through a time machine, to 1938. Perhaps this could have been the original red pill. Here at UR, we have many sinister devices, but a time machine is not really one of them. And fortunately, you do not live in Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, or 1938. And even more fortunately, your democratic education has vaccinated you to perfection against the first, and to an adequate, if unimpressive level against the second. And most importantly of all, your government is nothing like either Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. All good. But in 1938, 3 systems of government were contending for global supremacy. One of them is still around. Yours. Anglo-American liberal democracy. Had military luck favored either of the others, National Socialism or Marxist-Leninism, we can also be sure that it would have discovered and reveled in its foes' every misdeed, and that it would have approached its own, if at all, tentatively and ambiguously. If only one can survive, at least 2 must be illegitimate, and, therefore, irredeemably criminal. And the survivor will certainly paint them as such, but suppose all 3 are irredeemably criminal. If the third is an Orwellian mind control state as well, its subjects are unlikely to regard it as such. It will certainly not prosecute itself. The third, our third, is very different from the other 2. We must remember that American democracy is categorically distinct from National Socialism, and the people's democracies in too many ways to count. Since there are too many ways to count, we will not bother counting them. We remain entitled to notice parallels. For instance, it is almost more aesthetic criticism than political or economic analysis. But do read Wolfgang Scheivelbusch's Three New Deals. Wolfgang Scheivelbusch's Three New Deals, Reflections on Roosevelt's America, Mussolini's Italy, and Hitler's Germany, 1933 to 1939, first edition, is linked, actually, in hardcover here in this passage. But no number of categorical distinctions from the other two can alter our estimation of the third's criminality. There are as many ways to be a criminal as there are crimes. That we hang the murderer does not mean we must award a prize to the thief. I.e., the assumption that, since the Third Reich was Orwellian, and Barack Obama is not Adolf Hitler, Washington must not be Orwellian, is basically fallacious. Socrates is a cat. Ribbentrop is not Socrates. Therefore, Ribbentrop must not be a cat. Comparing the totalitarian dictatorships of the mid-20th century to the OECD democracies of the early 21st is like comparing a reptile to a mammal, a propeller plane to a jet plane, or a flashlight to a laser. We may learn something about the latter from the former, but we may not, and we may be easily misled. But there are what we think of when we think of Orwellian, and the association must be tackled first. Anyway, let's define this vague charge. What do you mean when you say Orwellian? I'd say a fair definition of an Orwellian government is one whose public or principle of public legitimacy, Mosca's political formula, if you care, linked here to Gratiano Mosca, an Italian pronunciation there, was an Italian political scientist, journalist, and public servant, a teacher at the University of Palermo who was historically right-wing. He's credited with developing the elite theory and the principle of the political class, and is one of three members constituting the Italian school of elitism, together with Villafred Pareto and Robert Michels. I strongly suspect I'm going to mispronounce some of these, but I'm just going to have to do what I can. He died in 8th November 1941 at the age of 83. Is contradicted by an accurate perception of reality. In other words, the government is existentially dependent on systematic public deception. If it fails in its mission to keep the lie alive, it at least stands some chance of falling. The basic premise of UR is that all the competing 20th century systems of government, including the Western democracies, which came out on top and which rule us to this day, are best classified as Orwellian. They maintain their legitimacy by shaping public opinion. They shape public opinion by sculpting this information presented to the public. As part of that public, you peruse the world through a lens poured by your government, i.e., you are pwned. Linked here is the Urban Dictionary term for pwned, a corruption of the word owned. This originated in the online game World of Warcraft, where map designers spelled owned and misspelled it when the computer beat a player. It was supposed to say pwned or owned so-and-so, right? So when somebody would beat somebody else, it would say it has been owned. Instead, it said so-and-so has been pwned. This book is a very 2009 book. Thus, the red pill, any stimulus or stimulant, pharmaceutical or literary, that fundamentally compromises said system of deception. That sounds very medical, but let's be clear, you are not taking our pill as a public service. At least, with our present crude packaging, the remedy is not accessible to any politically significant percentage of citizens. Rather, you're dosing up because you'd rather be high. Despite the agony of ingestion, it's just too much fun to see your old reality from the outside. This, rather than society, quote-unquote, is why you will return to UR, Unqualified Reservations, again and again. Seen from the outside, the Western democracies are particularly elegant examples of Orwellian engineering. They function in the context of a free press and fair contested elections. They operate no gulags. Not only has UR never been bothered by the authorities, I have not received a single private communication that I would describe as, in any sense, unfriendly. This may have changed since 2009. So, how on earth can such a system be described as Orwellian? Well, easily, of course. Everyone describes it as Orwellian, Professor Chomsky for one, but UR gets the same result in a very different way. You now enter a journey from which your soul may not return. Don't say we didn't warn you. The back button is up and to the left. Like yourself the way you are? You may want to press that back button. Alright. It's actually quite simple to demonstrate how you've been pwned, quote unquote. Let's start the show with one of UR's earliest Sith mind tricks. Cited here, Jedi mind tricks are blue pills. Sith mind tricks are basically red pills. Suffice it to say that you've been exposed to a lot of anti-Sith propaganda. We'll explain with a point of agreement. As a good citizen of America, which is the greatest country on earth, one thing you believe in is separation of church and state. I too am an American, and it so happens that I too believe in separation of church and state. Although one might argue that my interpretation of that formula is very different from yours. So, let's understand what we mean by the formula, word by word. What do you mean when we say, quote, state? We mean the government. I trust that's sufficiently clear. What do you mean by separation? Well, if A and B are separated, A has nothing to do with B. E.g., whether church and state are separated, they have as much to do with each other as the Albanian Gulf Federation and the Alaskan Alliance for Beef, i.e., nothing, ideally. I think that's pretty clear. If the Alaska cattleman can rent that course outside Durazzo, cited here Durazzo. Durazzo is, of course, a city in Albania in which there is a significant racetrack. So can anyone else. Presumably the opposite. Bad of separation, good would be union of church and state. What do we mean by church? Bueller? Bueller? Clearly, if we have some general objection to the union of church and state, these objections must in some way be derived from some generic definition of the word church. But when we use words like church, religion, etc., while it is very easy to think of examples, like the Catholic Church, Islam, etc., it is considerably more difficult to construct a description which includes all the examples, and excludes all the non-examples. Of course, one may have a perfectly reasonable prejudice against the Pope, Muslims, etc., but if so, why not just say so? For example, it is very easy to include God or gods in one's definition of church. In that case, though, we would have to throw out Buddhism, which is surely a legitimate religion. I assume your version of separation of church and state includes separation of Buddhism and state, because mine sure does. What about Scientology? Shouldn't we have separation of Scientology and state? I'm guessing you're going to sign up for that one as well. The question starts to seem difficult. So, let's procrastinate. For a straw definition of church, though, let's say a church is an organization or movement which specializes in telling people what to think. I would not inquire into this definition too closely, lest you ruin the suspense. But surely it fits Scientology, the Southern Baptists, Buddhism, etc. That's close enough for now. The definition of state, separation, and church gives us three interpretations of why separation of church and state is a good idea. 1. Our definition of church might include the stipulation that a church is an organization which distributes misinformation, i.e., lies and falsifiable hypotheses and other bogus truths. This sounds very sensible, because we don't want the state to distribute misinformation. On the other hand, this is not a very useful definition. It is equivalent to a restriction that union of church and state is okay, so long as the state church teaches only the truth. Naturally, according to the church, it teaches only the truth. But it is difficult to imagine a clause in the Constitution which states, Congress shall establish a church which shall teach only the truth. From an engineering perspective, the restriction is more effective if it does not depend on some process for distinguishing true churches from false churches. You think? 2, the second one, we might say that whether they teach the truth or not, churches are just a bad idea, period. People should think for themselves. They should not have thoughts broadcast into a little antenna in the back of their skull. Therefore, the state should separate itself from the church, just because a good state should separate itself from all evil things. But, fortunately or unfortunately, there is no kingdom of philosophers. Most people do not think for themselves, should not think for themselves, and cannot be expected, reasonably, to think for themselves. They do exactly what they should be doing, and trust others to work out the large philosophical truths of the world for them. This trust may be well placed, or not, but surely this mechanism of delegation is an essential part of human society, at least with the humans that we have now. 3, the third point, we might believe that a government should not tell its subject what to think. Since this is the only option I have left, it is the one I will have to follow. I'd like to think you follow it as well. If not quite for the same reason, well, let's think about it. There are two kinds of government. Those whose formula and legitimacy depend on popular consent, and those who don't. Following contemporary usage, we classify these as authoritarian or democratic. An authoritarian state has no need to tell its subjects what to think, because it has no reason to care what they think. In a truly authoritarian government, the ruling authority relies on force, not popularity. It cares what its subjects do, not what they think. It may encourage a healthy, optimistic attitude and temperate lifestyle proclivities, but only because this is good for business. Therefore, any authoritarian state that needs an official religion must have something wrong with it. Perhaps, for example, its military authority is not as absolute as it likes to think. A democratic state, which tells its citizens what to think, is a political solecism. Think about the motivation for democracy. It consigns the state to the collective responsibility of its citizens, because it feels this is an independent and well-anchored hook, on which to hang the common good. Once the republic has an established church, the hook is no longer independent, and the postulated value added of democracy is essentially nullified. Without separation of church and state, it is easy for a democracy to indulge itself in arbitrarily irresponsible misgovernment. Simply by telling its bishops to inform their congregations that black is white and white is black, and thus, misdirected, they are easily persuaded to support counterproductive policies, which they wrongly consider to be productive. A common syndrome is the case in which a purported solution is in fact the cause of the problem. As a Russian politician once said of his opponents, quote, "These people think they are doctors of society, but in fact they are the disease." This is citation 1 in the book. This is a slight misquote of Alexander Herzen, the, quote, "father of Russian socialism," unquote, who reportedly once declared, not to his opponents, but to his fellow revolutionaries, that, quote, "we are not the doctors, we are the disease," unquote. Herzen meant this as an exhortation to tear down the existing order and overthrow the Tsar, of course. It is, indeed, unsurprising that Nassim Taleb has just learned the word iatrogenic. By the way, if you know Taleb, please point him at UR. If you know someone who knows Taleb, please. This book was written in 2009. Union of church and state can foster stable iatrogenic misgovernment as follows. First, the church fosters and maintains a popular misconception that the problem exists. Then, the solution solves it. Secondly, the state responds by extruding an arm, agency, or other pseudopod in order to apply the solution. Agency and church are thus cooperating in the creation of unproductive or counterproductive jobs as, quote, doctors, unquote. Presumably, they can find a way to split the take. The root problem with a state church in a democratic state is that, to believe in democracy, one must believe that the levers of power terminate with the voters. But if your democracy has an effective state church, the actual levers of power pass through the voters, go back to the church. The church teaches the voters what to think. The voters tell the politicians what to do. Naturally, it is easy for the politicians to short-circuit this process and just listen to the bishops. Thus, the government has a closed power loop, with the church at its apex, of course, which is exactly what we were hoping to avoid when we declared to make our state democratic, rather than authoritarian. An independent and unaccountable authority, which is in charge of everything else. In this case, our authority is, of course, the church itself. Oops. We have engineered ourselves a great big bucket of failure. In other words, our so-called democracy is dependent not on the wisdom of the people, but on the internal power politics of the official church. If these politics produce a political platform which translate to responsible and effective actions, the government will be good. If they don't, it will suck. Either way, we have consigned the state to an unaccountable conclave of bishops. Why this is an improvement on monarchy, or any other form of autocracy, is basically unclear. This political architecture, an abortion by any standard, is commonly known as theocracy. Oddly enough, the classic historical case of a theocracy is... hang on, I'm forgetting it. Yeah, right here. In North America, under the strange people we call the Puritans. A more precise label would be the Brownists. I'm with Shakespeare on this one. Note that, cleanistically speaking, we are all Brownists now, and Carter Van Carter has told us all about Whitby. Let Daniel Howe fill you in on Scrooby. Linked here was once the website Scrooby. The book The Puritan Republic of the Massachusetts Bay in New England, written by Daniel Waite Howe, is linked here currently. For those who prefer their history fresh, rather than aged, we can turn to Darren Staloff, whose Making of an American Thinking Class, Intellectuals and Intelligentsia in Puritan Massachusetts, is badly written, but quite informative. Professor Staloff writes, italics is his, I'll put it in a different voice, the Puritan ministers created a completely new form of political authority in the Weberian sense of legitimate power, which I have called cultural domination. Cultural domination, as here conceived, requires four formal supports. First of all, like charismatic authority, it requires recognition in the form of ritual election, or some similar mechanism of oath-swearing or covenant signing. Fealty is sworn to the, quote, correct, unquote, cultural formation, in this case Puritan biblicism, and the office holder is empowered only as the specially trained bearer and interpreter of the cultural tradition. The laity generally conceive of this high cultural training, whether concerned around biblicism or some other intellectually legitimating principle, like reason or rationality, as being endowed with an automatic efficacy that need simply be applied to any problem to generate an unequivocal solution. The biblical truth is eternal and immutable, claimed Thomas Hooker. Quote, but the alteration grows, according to God's most just judgment, and their own deservings. Unquote. Such belief gives rise to the second formal requirement, that official authorized bearers of the cultural tradition must always agree in their public formulations, or at least not disagree. If this condition is violated, the laity may come to see the cultural tradition as an amorphous collection of expressions or principles manipulated by, quote, mandarins, unquote, for their own aggrandizement. The third requirement is that all public expressions of the culturally able must be bestowed on these public acts, including forced attendance, titulary homage, and silent obedience. Finally, to ensure the stability of the entire system, unauthorized cultural expressions must be carefully monitored and severely suppressed when they contradict or threaten to, quote, desacralize, unquote, the authorized formula. The crafty Professor Staloff, like all good historians, is trying to sneak a message about the present into his narrative of the past. Note that little quibble back there. Or some other intellectually legitimating principle like reason or rationality. Why would he say that? Professor Staloff, who has clearly been reading too much H.P. Lovecraft, provides a clue in his introduction. How could an educated elite of ministers and magistrates, as I learned from Timothy Breen, hold such dominant power in a fledgling colonial settlement? Granted the deference normally accorded a university degree, these educated leaders lacked the large-scale property interests normally associated with a ruling class or ruling stratum. What were the institutional arrangements and practices that facilitated this remarkable empowerment? Finally, why did this elite choose to use their power to impose an order on Massachusetts derived from academic theology? And what did it mean that the Bay Colony was patterned after a high cultural theory? I sought the answer to these questions in the library of Miskatonic University. Two works in particular: Falconer's 3-volume Cryptomenesis Patefacta and von Juntz's strange Una aus Prekeilen Kulten confirmed my most unsettling hunches. Professional intellectuals and intelligentsia comprised a collective interest. They were the great unexamined class in modern political history, whose will to power occasionally took the form of revolutionary ideological politics. I had a greater appreciation, then, for the mad Arab Abdul al-Haddad's claim that the Puritan divines were the precursors of the Jacobins and the Bolsheviks. Professor Staloff, we see, speaks elliptically, but with great urgency. What exactly is his message to the uninitiated? How can we translate this dark prophecy into the plain Saxon tongue? I'm afraid the proposition Professor Staloff is hinting at is that we do have a church, and a state church. It just doesn't call itself that, because why would it? By this simple twitch of the hips, like a receiver dodging a linebacker, it's faked out your intellectual immune system, off of its feet. Not to worry. The red pill's here to help. Like Professor Staloff, I have considered my definition of church as a trap. If you've been following along, without suspicion, you are in the trap. Now we're going to close the lid. Notice that our definition of church has not invoked any of the typical attributes of religion. In particular, we have avoided any requirement that A. the doctrines of the church be either partially or entirely supernatural in nature. Think of Buddhism, or Scientology, or for that matter Nazism or Bolshevism. Or B. the structure of the church be in any way centrally organized. A Quaker theocracy is just as excluded as a Catholic theocracy. And once your church is united with the state, there is no shortage of structure. We have just said, a church is an organization or movement which tells people how to think. A broad definition, but it turns out to be perfectly adequate to validate our case for separation of church and state, and it contains all our test cases. There's just one problem. The definition is way too broad. It captures some cases which we obviously don't want to include. See, under this definition, Harvard's a church. And we surely can't mean that there should be separation of Harvard and state. Yet, somehow, this is the result the computer keeps giving us. Perhaps there is some mistake. We have stumbled, of course, into Professor Staloff's definition. Unlike the Harvard of 1639, the Harvard of 2009 bases its authority not on the interpretation of Scripture, but on some other intellectually legitimating principle like reason or rationality. Everything else is the same. It could be, of course, that Harvard of 2009's application of reason or rationality is inherently accurate, i.e., endowed with an automatic efficacy that need simply be applied to any problem to generate an unequivocal solution. Whether or not this is the case, many behave as though it were. But even if it is, all we are looking at is a condition you rejected earlier as unsatisfactory, a state church that teaches only the truth. Perhaps Harvard of 2009 teaches only the truth. The Harvard of 2010? Of 2020? We resign the answer to the tempests of academic power politics. If this is transparent and accountable, well, so is mud. The basic security hole is the word education. Education is defined as the inculcation of correct facts and good morals. Thus, an institution which is educated and secular, such as Harvard, simply becomes a, quote, church which shall teach only the truth, unquote. Like the Puritans of old New England, in seeking to disestablish one state church, we have essentially established another. It is also very hard to argue that we enjoy, quote, separation of Harvard and state, unquote. Harvard is conventionally described as a private university. This term is strictly nominal. Vast streams of cash flow from the taxpayer's pocket into Harvard's, as they do not flow to, say, the Vatican. And we see easily that Harvard is attached to something, because the perspective of Harvard in 2009, while wildly different from the perspective of Harvard in 1959, is not in any way different from the perspective of Stanford in 2009. If a shared attachment to Uncle Sam isn't what keeps Harvard and Stanford on the same page, what is? It's not football, I can tell you that. Except for a few unimportant institutions of non-mainstream religious affiliation, we simply do not see multiple, divergent, competing schools of thought within the American university system at this time. The whole vast archipelago, though evenly speckled with a salting of contrarians, displays no factional structure whatsoever. It seems almost synchronized. There are two explanations for this synchronization. One, Harvard and Stanford are synchronized because they both arrive at the same truth. I'm willing to concede this for, say, chemistry. When it comes to, say, African American studies, I'm not quite so sure. Are you? Surely it is arguable that the latter is a legitimate area of inquiry, but surely it is arguable that it is also not. So how is it exactly that Harvard, Stanford, and everyone else gets to the exact same answer? I'm afraid the only logical alternative, however awful and unimaginable, is the conclusion that Harvard and Stanford are synchronized because both are remeras attached in some unthinkable way to some great invisible predator of the deep, perhaps even Cthulhu himself. Certainly, the synchronization is not coordinated by any human hierarchical authority. Yes, there are accreditation agencies, but a Harvard or a Stanford could easily fight them. The system may be Orwellian, but it has no Goebbels. It produces Gleichschaltung without a Gestapo. Cited here, Gleichschaltung is a reference to the German system of Nazification by which Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party successfully established a system of totalitarian control and coordination over all aspects of German society and societies occupied by Nazi Germany. Quote, from the economy and trade associations to the media, culture, and education. It produces Gleichschaltung without a Gestapo. It has a party line without a party. It's a pretty neat trick. We of the Sith would certainly like to understand it. And we are again reminded of the half-mad words of the late Professor Staloff. Officially authorized bearers of the cultural tradition must always agree in their public formulations, or at least not disagree. If this condition is violated, the laity may come to see the cultural tradition as an amorphous collection of expressions or principles manipulated by mandarins for their own aggrandizement. But if Harvard in 2009 fits this description, how exactly is said agreement enforced? If you've never met any of the officially authorized bearers, you know the last thing they think of themselves as being is officially authorized bearers. And it is only one thing to say they must always agree, another to make them actually do that. No one does. And yet, they agree. Their views change over time, and they all change in the same direction at the same rate. There is a strange, self-organizing quality about this design. Does the American university system maintenance of broad unanimity, despite the clear absence of anything like a coordinated executive authority, make it seem less creepy to you or more? I'm going to go with more on this one. Moreover, if we broaden our focus from the university system to the entire system of, quote, education, unquote, from grade school to journalism, we see this effect again and again. What exactly is the mainstream media? If we accept the ecclesiastical metaphor, the newspaper is a perfect analog of the church proper. It is simply the latest transmission technology for your worm's daily or weekly security update. And here again, a coordinated message, without any central agency. Dude, if you don't find this creepy, I gotta ask why not. But maybe it's all an abstraction to you. Well, let's make it slightly more concrete. In 1963, a long time ago, but in the lives of many now living, the citizens of California, by a majority of nearly 2/3, voted to pass a law called Proposition 14, cited here. This amended the state constitution to add the following. Neither the state nor any subdivision or agency thereof shall deny, limit, or abridge, directly or indirectly, the right of any person who is willing or desires to sell, lease, or rent any part of or all of his rental property or real property to decline to sell, lease, or rent such property to such persons or persons as he, in his absolute discretion, chooses. In other words, if you don't want to live with persons of color, you don't have to. The amendment obviously turned out to be unconstitutional, just like this one. Cited here, 1994 California Proposition 187, also known as the SOS Save Our State Initiative. It was a 1994 ballot initiative to establish a state-run citizenship screening system and prohibit undocumented immigrants from using non-emergency health care, public education, and other services in the state of California. Voters passed and proposed law at a referendum on November 8, 1994. And we have persons of color in California to this day. In fact, we have so many of them that California in 2008 elected Barack Obama, noted person of color, by almost the same margin that its 1963 predecessor passed Prop 14. Part of this political change was due to said demographic shift, but not all. So, how exactly did California change from a state that would vote for Prop 14 to one that would elect Obama? Was this change predictable? Was it inevitable in some sense? Again, we are seeing the movement of a bobber on the water. What's the bobber attached to? Is it a bluegill? Or is it Cthulhu? If you're still clinging to the Matrix, you might say the change happened because Prop 14 was wrong and the election of Obama was right. Suppose we agree with you. But why exactly should we have been so confident in expecting a change from wrong to right? If there is some mechanism large and powerful enough to drag the public opinion of California in 45 years from Prop 14 to Obama, maybe not Cthulhu, but definitely not a bluegill, shouldn't we expect to be just as easily dragged back from right to wrong? Will segregation make a comeback in San Francisco? If not, why not? Whatever our Cthulhu may be, it is interesting to note that there is an algorithm for predicting the movement of the bobber, on a number of subjects, not just segregation. I note that the public opinion of California in 2008 is quite similar to the public opinion of Stanford in 1963. This is easy to explain. In post-1945 America, the source of all new ideas is the university. Ideas check out of the university, but they hardly ever check in. Thence, they flow outward to the other arms of the educational systems as a whole, the mainstream media and the public schools. Eventually, they become our old friend, public opinion. This process is slow, happening on a generational scale, and thus a 45-year lag. Thus, whatever coordinates the university system coordinates the state, through the transmission device of public opinion. Naturally, since this is 100% effective, the state does not have to wait for the transmission to complete necessarily. It can act in advance of a complete response. As in this case, the Supreme Court did in 1967 and synchronized directly with the universities. This relationship, whose widespread practice in the United States dates back to 1933, is known as, quote, public policy, unquote. Essentially, for everything your government does, there is a university department full of professors who can and do tell it what to do. Civil servants and congressional staffers follow the technical lead of the universities. The residual Democratic branch of Washington. The White House can sometimes push back feebly, but only with great difficulty. What's neat is that because of our Army's great success in the early 1940s, the government of other countries respond to American public policy as well. The synchronization is international. Some of America's little friends overseas, such as Britain, have universities in the second rank, but there is only one global post-war academic system, the American one, and all top-tier universities are in the United States at this time. The cause by which policies devised by this system are passed off as global, transcending mere nationality is sometimes called transnationalism, or globalism. But I digress. The triangle of professors, bureaucrats, and public opinion is stable because the professors teach as well as advise. Of course, there's a time lag. The system experiences some strain, but it will stay together, so long as the polarity does not randomly reverse, i.e., Cthulhu suddenly decides to swim right rather than left. But no, Cthulhu may swim slowly, but he only swims left. Isn't that interesting? In the history of American democracy, if you take the mainstream political position of the Overton window, cited here, the Overton window is generally a tool used to describe the range of policies politically acceptable to the mainstream population at any given time. It's basically the window of discourse. It was written by Joseph P. Overton. In the history of American democracy, if you take the mainstream political position, the Overton window, at time t1 and place it on the map at a time later than time t2, t1 is always to the right, or near the fringe, or even outside of it. So, for instance, if you take the average segregationist voter of 1963 and let him vote in the 2008 election, he will be way out on the wacky right wing. Cthulhu passed him by. Where's the John Birch Society now? What about the NAACP? Cthulhu swims left and left and left. There are a few brief periods of true reaction in American history. The post-Reconstruction era, or Redemption, the Return to Normalcy of Harding, and a couple of others. But they are usually unusual and feeble compared to the great leftward shift. Nor, most important for our hypothesis, did they come from the universities. In the 20th century, periods of reaction are always periods of anti-university activity. McCarthyism is especially noticeable as such. And you'll note, that McCarthy didn't exactly win. The principle applies even in war. In each of the following conflicts in Anglo-American history, you see a victory of the left over the right. The English Civil War, the so-called Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, World War I, World War II. Clearly, if you want to be on the winning team, you want to start on the left side of the field. And we are starting to piece a puzzle together. The leftward direction is, itself, the principle of organization. In a two-party democratic system, with Whigs and Tories, Democrats and Republicans, the intelligentsia is always Whig. Their party is simply the party of those who want to get ahead. It is the party of the celebrities, the ultra-rich, the great and the good. The flexible of conscience, Tories, Republicans, are always misfits, losers, or just plain stupid. Sometimes all three. And the left is the party of the educational organs, to those at whose head is the press and the universities. Citation 2. The entertainment industry arguably belongs on this list as well. This is our 20th century version of the established church. Here at UR, we sometimes like to call it the cathedral. Citation 3. This terminology is not meant to disparage real cathedrals. The main rhetorical point is that members of the cathedral are, despite their avowed secularism and faux egalitarianism, in effect, a theocratic priestly class. Cathedral. Although it is essential to note that, unlike an ordinary organization, it has no central admin. No, this will not make it easier to deal with. The opposite, in fact. This strange chiral asymmetry implies some fundamental difference between right and left. What is that difference? What does it mean to be left rather than right? How can an entire system of independent thinkers and institutions, without any central coordinating agency, recognize that everyone should go left rather than right? First, we need to define left and right. In my opinion, obviously a controversial one. The explanation for this mysterious asymmetrical dimension is easy. It's political entropy. Right represents peace, order, security. Left generally represents war, anarchy, and crime. That's a decision, sir. Because values are inherently subjective, it is possible to argue that left can be good and right can be bad. For example, you could say that the Civil War was good. The North needed to conquer the South and free the slaves. On the other hand, it is also quite easy to construct a very clean value system in which order is simply good and chaos is simply evil. I have chosen this path. It leaves quite a capacious cavity in the back of my skull and allows me to call myself a reactionary to you. Perhaps it is my dark side. But this is only because the treatment is not yet complete. You'll be here soon enough. Whatever you make of the left-right axis, you have to admit that there exists some force which has been pulling the Anglo-American political sphere leftward for at least the last 300 years. Whatever this unfathomable stellar emanation may be, it's gotten us from the Stuarts to Barack Obama. Personally, I'd like a refund, but that's just me. It is time to understand this force. My theory is that what we're looking at is the attraction of power itself. Citation 4. More specifically, power gained by sowing disorder and subverting natural hierarchy, per the identification of left as the direction of increasing political entropy. As Jim, cited here Jim's blog, Liberty in an Unfree World, in socialism, leftism has no essence. It is just a coalition to knock over the apple cart in order to grab some of the apples. So, lefter is whatever direction looks like some apples could be knocked loose. The left attracts a natural coalition because it always attracts those whose only interest is in the pure thrill of domination. Most will join them through peer pressure alone, leaving only left the misfits. Let's look for a minute at the minds of the people who hold positions of power. Your R1 professors. Cited here, R1 really means RI. There's a misclick here. Research I University is the category of the Carnegie classification of institutions of higher education. which he uses to indicate universities of the United States that engage in the highest levels of research activity. That's a mouthful. Your Times reporters and so on. These are, of course, very competitive jobs. Only a tiny minority of the people who want them and are capable of doing them will ever get them. They have certainly worked very hard to get where they are, and they perceive the effort as being one made in the interest of humanity at large. I think the salaries at this level are actually pretty reasonable, but it is not money that makes people want these jobs. I think it's power, which brings it with it status. I define power as personal influence over important events. I don't really know of any other functional definition. One of the key reasons that intellectuals are fascinated by disorder, in my opinion, is that the fact that disorder is an extreme case of complexity. And as you make the structure of authority in an organization more complex, more informal, or both, as you fragment it, eliminating hierarchical execution structures under which one individual decides and is responsible for the result, and replacing them with highly fragmented, highly consensual, and highly process-oriented structures in which 10, 20, or 100 people can truthfully claim to have contributed to the outcome, you increase the amount of power, status, and patronage and employment you produce. Of course, you also make the organization less efficient and effective, and you make working with it a lot less fun for everyone, and you have gone from startup to Dilbert. This is Brezhnevian sclerosis, the fatal disease of organizations in a highly regulated environment. All work is guided by some systemic process, in which each rule was contributed to by someone whose importance was a function of how many rules he added. In the future, we will all work for the government, individually. This is the last thing your average intellectual wants to do, but it's the direction in which his collective acts are pushing us. In short, intellectuals cluster to the left, generally adopting, as a social norm, the principle of pas d'ennemi à gauche, pas d'amis à droite. Citation 5, here written, usually rendered in English as, no enemies to the left, no friends to the right. Because, like everyone else, they are drawn to power. The left is chaos and anarchy, and the more anarchy you have, the more power there is to go around. The same asymmetry is why corporations in the military, whose system of hierarchical executive authority is inherently orderly, cluster to the right. Once the cluster exists, however, it works by any means necessary. The reverence of anarchy is a mindset which an essentially Machiavellian tribal model of power flourishes. To the bishops of the cathedral, anything that strengthens their influence is a good thing, and vice versa. The analysis is completely reflexive, far below the conscious level. Consider the comparison of this coverage between the regime of Pinochet and that of Castro. Despite atrocities that are comparable, at most, not to mention a much better record in providing responsible and effective government, Pinochet reserves the full-out 2 minutes of hate, to quote Orwell, whereas the treatment of Castro tends to have, at most, a gentle and wistful disapproval. This is because Pinochet's regime was completely alien to the American intellectual, whereas the relationship between Puritan divines and Bolshevism being exactly as the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazreb says, Castro's regime was something much more than understandable. If you sketch the relative weights of the social networks connecting Pinochet to the cathedral versus Castro to the cathedral, you're comparing a thread to a bicep. We also see the nature of the blue pill here. After completing the UR treatment, it is interesting to go back and read your Chomsky. You'll see that Chomsky is, in every case, demanding that all political power be put in the hands of the cathedral. The American system is certainly very large and complex, and what Chomsky wants is certainly not the case. The least exception, or, God forbid, reversal, and Chomsky is on the case, deploying the old principle of, quote, this animal is very dangerous. When attacked, it defends itself. Citation 6 here. The original version of the saying is a French rhyming proverb. Ce animal est très méchant. Quand l'attaque, il se défend. A rhyming English translation has been composed of, by all people, Lolita author Vladimir Nabokov. This beast is very mean. In fact, it will fight back when it is attacked. Back to citation 6. The progressive is always the underdog in his own mind. Yet, in objective reality, he always seems to win in the end. In other words, the Chomskyan transformation is to interpret any resistance by a party which is inherently much weaker as oppression, by a magic force of overwhelming strength. For example, we can ask, which set of individuals exerts more power over American journalists? American professors or American CEOs? American diplomats or American generals? In both cases, the answer is clearly the former. Yet any hint of corporate or military influence over the press is, of course, anathema. If anyone is in an obvious position to manufacture consent, it is, as Walter Lippmann openly proposed, first, the journalists themselves, next, the universities which they regard as authoritative. Yet, strangely, the leftists have no interest whatsoever in this security hole. This can only be because it is already plugged with his worm. The complaint of the Chomskyan, in other words, always occurs when the other team is impudent enough to try to manufacture a bit of its own consent. Hence, the blue pill. And there's another card that I've been holding back on. See, the problem is not that our present system of government, which might be described succinctly as an atheistic theocracy, is accidentally similar to Puritan Massachusetts. As anatomists would put it, these structures are not just analogs or analogous, they are homologous or homologous. This architecture of government, theocracy secured through democratic means, is a single continuous thread in American history. An excellent historical description of this continuity is in George McKenna's Puritan Origins of American Patriotism. It gets a little confused in the 20th century, but this is to be expected. However, as a demonstration, I am particularly partial to one particular primary source, American Malvern, from 1942, which I found somehow in Times Magazine's online archive. Religion. American Malvern. Monday, March 16th, 1942. These are the high spots of organized U.S. Protestantism. Super Protestant, new program for a just and durable peace after World War II. Ultimately, first point. Ultimately, a world governed of delegated powers. Second point. Complete abandonment of U.S. isolationism. Third point. Strong immediate limitations on national sovereignty. Fourth point. International control of all armies and navies. Fifth point. A universal system of money, so planned as to prevent inflation and deflation. Sixth point. Worldwide development of immigration. Seventh point. Progressive elimination of all tariff and quota restrictions on world trade. Eighth point. All autonomy for all subject and colonial peoples, with much better treatment for Negroes in the U.S. Ninth point. No punitive reparations, no humiliating decrees of war guilt, no arbitrary dismemberment of nations. 10th point. A democratically controlled international bank to make development capital in all parts of the world without the predatory and imperialistic aftermath, so characteristics of large-scale private and governmental loans. This program was adopted last week by 375 appointed representatives of 30-odd denominations, called together at Ohio Wesleyan University by the Federal Council of Churches. Every local Protestant church in the country will now be urged to get behind the program as Christian citizens. Its sponsors affirmed, we must seek to translate our beliefs into practical realities, and to create a public opinion for which will ensure that the United States shall play its full and essential part in the creation of a moral way of international living. Among the 375 delegates who drafted the program were 15 bishops and 5 denominations, 7 seminary heads, including Yale, Chicago, Princeton, Colgate, Rochester. 8 college and university presidents, including Princeton's Harold W. Dodds. Practically all the ranking officials of the Federal Council, and a group of well-known laymen, including John R. Mott, Irving Fisher, and Harvey S. Firestone, Jr. Intellectually, said Methodist Bishop Ivan Lee Holt of Texas, this is the most distinguished American church gathering I have seen in 30 years of conference going. The meeting showed its temper early by passing a set of 13 requisite principles for peace, submitted by Chairman John Foster Dulles and his Interchurch Commission to study the basis of a just and durable peace. These principles, far from putting all of the onus on Germany or Japan, bade the U.S. give thought to the short-sighted selfishness of its own policies after World War I, declared that the U.S. would have to turn over a new leaf if the world is to enjoy lasting peace. Excerpts. For at least a generation we have held preponderant economic power in the world, and with it the capacity to influence decisively the shaping of world events. It should be a matter of shame and humiliation to us that actually the influences shaping the world have largely been irresponsible forces. Our own positive influence has been impaired because of concentration on self and our short-range material gains. If the future is to be other than a repetition of the past, the U.S. must accept the responsibility for constructive action commensurate with its power and opportunity. The natural wealth of the world is not evenly distributed. Accordingly, the possession of such natural resources is a trust to be discharged in the general interest. This calls for more than an offer to sell to all on equal terms. Such an offer may be a futile gesture unless those in need can, through the selling of their own goods and services, acquire the means of buying. With these principles accepted, the conference split up into 4 groups of study, respectively, the social, economic, and political problems of the post-war world, and the problem of the Church's own position in that world. Discussion waxed hot and heavy, and one notable silence. In a week when the Japs were taking Java, discussion of the war itself was practically taboo. Reason: the Federal Council felt that, since 5 of its other commissions were directly connected to the war effort, the conference's concern should be with the plans for peace. One more statement: the Christian Church, as such, is not at war, was proposed by editor Charles Clayton Morrison, of the influential and isolationist before Pearl Harbor Christian Century. This statement was actually inserted in a subcommittee report by a 64-58 vote after sharp debate. In the plenary session, however, it was ruled out of order. Some of the conference's economic opinions were almost as sensational as the extreme internationalism of its political program. It held that a new order of economic life is both imminent and imperative, a new order that is sure to come through either voluntary cooperation within the framework of democracy or through explosive political revolution. Without condemning the profit motive as such, it denounced various defects in the profit system for breeding war, demagogues and dictators, mass unemployment, widespread dispossession from homes and farms, and destitution. Instead, the Church must demand economic arrangements measured by human welfare, must appeal to the Christian motive of human services as paramount to personal gain or governmental coercion. Collectivism is coming, whether we like it or not, the delegates were told by no less a churchman than England's Dr. William Peyton, co-secretary of the World Council of Churches. But the conference did not veer as far to the left as its previously, definitely, pinko British counterpart, the now famous Malvern Conference, time January 20, 1941. It did, however, back up labor's demand for an increasing share in industrial management. It echoed labor's shibboleth that the denial of collective bargaining reduces labor to a commodity. It urged taxation designed to the end that our wealth may be more equitably distributed. It urged experimentation with government and cooperative ownership. Every individual, the conference declared, has the right to full-time educational opportunities, to economic security in retirement, to adequate health service, and an obligation to work in some socially necessary service. The conference statement on the political basis of a just and durable peace proclaimed that the first post-war duty of the Church will be the achievement of a just peace settlement, with due regard to the welfare of all the nations. the vanquished, the overrun, and the victors alike. In contrast to the blockade of Germany after World War I, it called for immediate provision of food and other essentials after the war, for every country needing them. "We must get back," explained Methodist Bishop Francis J. McConnell, "to a stable material prosperity, not only to strengthen men's bodies, but to strengthen their souls." Politically, the conference's most important assertion was that many duties now performed by local and national governments can now be effectively carried out by an international authority. Individual nations, it declared, must give up their armed forces, except for preservation of domestic order, and allow the world to be policed by an international army and navy. This League of Nations with teeth would also have the power of final judgment in controversies between nations, the regulation of international trade, and population movements among nations. The ultimate goal: a duly constituted world government, of delegated powers, an international legislative body, an international court with adequate jurisdiction, international administrative bodies with necessary powers, and adequate international police forces and provision for enforcing its worldwide economic authority. Despite their zeal for world political, social, and economic unity, these churchmen were less drastic when it came to themselves. They were frank enough to admit that their own lack of unity was no shining example to the secular world, but did no more than call for a new era of interdenominational cooperation, in which the claims of cooperative effort should be placed, so far as possible, before denominational prestige. The nice thing about reading a primary source from 1942 is that you are assured of its period credentials, unless of course someone has hacked Time's archive. The author cannot possibly know anything about 1943 if he's writing in 1942. If you find a text from 1942 that describes the H-bomb, you know that the H-bomb was known in 1942. One such text is largely, if not entirely, sufficient. What's great about American Malvern and its article is that, while it describes a political program you will place almost instantly, it describes it in a very odd way. You are used to thinking of this perspective, which is obviously somewhat toward the left on your NPR dial, as representative of a political movement. Instead, the anonymous Time reporter describes it as a religious, super-Protestant, to be exact, program. Isn't that bizarre? We have caught the worm in the act of turning. The political program and perspective that we think of as a progressive one is, or is at least descended from, the program of a religious sect. Unsurprisingly, this sect, best known as ecumenical mainline Protestantism, is historically the most powerful form of American Christianity. This happens to be the direct linear descendant of Professor Staloff's Puritans. You can also see it in abolitionism, the social gospel, the prohibitionists, and straight on down to global warming. That mindset never changes. For a brief snapshot of where it is today, try the Unitarian Church and Obama's religious upbringing. Note that Congregationalist and Puritan are basically synonyms now, and American Unitarianism is a spin-off of Congregationalism. Of course, these beliefs have evolved since the time when these labels meant anything. Since the 1960s, they have merged into one warm, mushy, NPR-flavored whole, which we here at UR sometimes refer to as universalism. Michael Lerner is perhaps the ultimate universalist. Thus we see the whole awful picture merged together. It is Cthulhu. We just don't live in something vaguely like a Puritan theocracy. We live in an actual, genuine, functioning, if hardly healthy, 21st century Puritan theocracy. What this means is that you can hardly trust any of your beliefs. You are educated by the system, which purports to be a truth machine, but is clearly nothing of the sort. Since the US is not the Soviet Union, hard scientific facts, physics, chemistry, and biology, are likely to not be wrong, but the Soviet Union actually did pretty well with those hard sciences, so. Other than that, you have no rational reason to trust anything coming out of the cathedral, that is, the universities and the press. You have no more reason to trust these institutions than you do to, say, the Vatican. In fact, they are motivated to mislead you in ways the Vatican is not. Because the Vatican does not have deep, murky, and self-serving connections with the Washington bureaucracy. They claim to be truth machines. Why wouldn't they? The cathedral, with its informal union of church and state, is perfectly positioned. It has all the advantages of being a formal arm of government, and none of the disadvantages. Because it formulates public policy, it is best considered our ultimate governing organ. But it certainly bears no responsibility for the success or failure of said policies. Moreover, it gets to program the little worm that is inserted in everyone's head, beginning at the age of 5 and going all the way through to grad school. Worst of all, the system is not a new one. It dates at least to FDR. Nor was the pre-FDR system of government in the United States of America particularly savory. Nor was the one before that, etc. If you want to be completely disillusioned with the mythic Americana, I recommend Peter Oliver, cited here. Peter S. Oliver's Origin and Progress of the American Rebellion, a Tory View, originally written in 1781. It is certainly interesting to know that ultimately, the reason Star-Spangled Banner waves over the home of the free and the land of the brave is that James Otis's father wasn't given a job. Citation 7. As Wikipedia notes, Otis graduated from Harvard in 1743 and rose meteorically to the top of Boston legal professions. In 1760, he received a prestigious appointment as Advocate General of the Admiralty Court. He promptly resigned. However, when Governor Francis Bernard failed to appoint his father to the promised position of Chief Justice of the province's High Court, the position instead went to longtime Otis opponent Thomas Hutchinson. In a dramatic turnabout following his resignation, Otis instead represented pro bono the colonial merchants who were challenging the legality of the writs of assistance before the Superior Court, the predecessor of the Massachusetts Judicial Court. So, it is no use deciding that the solution is to be a conservative. It is wonderful that you've gotten past progressivism, but you still need the red pill. The problem is much, much older and deeper than you think. I once teased the infamous Larry Auster, proprietor of View from the Right, or VFTR, from the web's most thoughtful, hardline conservative, that his blog should be called VFR 1960 instead of VFR, because he sides with the right on every conflict after 1960. Before 1960, however, VFR could accurately be renamed View from the Left. Larry Auster, bless his soul, didn't like that at all, but it still happens to be true. This is slightly daunting, but only slightly. We have not even gotten to the active ingredient in our red pill yet. Certainly not the awful sodium core. We have presented an alternate picture of reality, in which you live not in the free post-Orwellian world, but in an Orwellian mind control state, which is as nasty hangover from the old weird past. To verify this conviction, however, we need to catch said mind control in the state in the act of actually controlling our minds. Therefore, since we cannot trust our existing beliefs, we need to look at the areas in which our universalist educations may have caused us to misperceive reality, reassess our beliefs, and compare the reassessment to the orthodox of received truth. If we see discrepancies, we can confirm the Orwellian interpretation. If we see no discrepancies, perhaps the cathedral is just a truth machine after all.